Today on The Divide, Democrats are in control in Washington state and Washington, D.C. So why are their gun control policies still stalling?
We are in a public health crisis, and yet we still have not addressed another public health crisis we have, and that's gun violence.
It isn't a red issue or a blue issue. No shooter walked in and asked first, are you a Democrat or a Republican, before pulling the trigger.
Also, we chat with the latest candidate in the race for Seattle mayor, someone who joins a growing chorus of voices worried about the direction of the city.
I have heard this over and over again, this sense that we are not proud of this city.
Plus, they claim to be advocates for the homeless, but their actions tell a different story.
This is not right, and this is not helping the people who are unsheltered.
That and more as we attempt to bridge the divide. Welcome to The Divide. Thank you so much for joining us. As is common in America, there is a renewed debate over gun control following two mass shootings. One in the Atlanta area where a gunman killed 8 people, mostly Asian women, in a series of shootings at massage parlors. And then in Boulder, Colorado, where a man opened fire in the middle of the afternoon in a grocery store, killing 10 people, including a police officer. Following those shootings, Senator Patty Murray of our state reflected on our own tragedies here in Washington and placed blame for a lack of progress on gun control.
In our state and my state, families will never be the same after Marysville, after Mukilteo, after the Seattle Jewish Federation, and so many others. According to the Giffords Law Center, there are 753 gun deaths in Washington state each year. That amounts to 1 every 12 hours. For years, Democrats have pushed for action to stop this killing with common sense reform that will save lives. For years, we've been blocked by Republican leaders and their special interests. Now, we can act, and we will.
And it's true, Democrats have for years tried to push policies like banning so-called assault rifles and high-capacity magazines to no avail. In our state, those proposals have repeatedly failed to gain traction despite years of Democratic majorities in Olympia. There's been a proposed ban on assault weapons introduced in Olympia every single year since 2017, and it hasn't gone anywhere despite Democratic control of both the House and Senate, with the exception of 2017, when power was still split. The same is true for a ban on high-capacity magazines. Year after year, despite Democratic control that would allow them to pass it with a simple majority, that proposal keeps stalling out. So, can Democrats really continue to put the blame on Republicans for failing to vote on, let alone pass, what they say is a key priority? And as Democrats also take control in Washington, D.C., will they similarly run out of people to blame? I spoke with Democratic State Senator Patty Kuderer and Democratic Congresswoman Susan DelBene. Senator Murray blamed Republicans really for years blocking progress on meaningful gun control. Given the fact, though, that Democrats now control Congress and Olympia, is that sort of excuse running out of steam? Congresswoman, I'll start with you because you might have an out with the Senate filibuster a little bit.
Well, and we just passed legislation in the House. The bipartisan background checks bill passed with bipartisan support. And so if we have a bill on the floor, folks vote, we know that we have an opportunity to bring folks together in a bipartisan way. The majority of Americans support enhanced background checks. So this is a bipartisan issue. The only place we're seeing the challenge is in the Senate right now. We have an opportunity to move it forward and really represent the views of the American people. And so we did that in the House, and that's why it's so important for the Senate to move.
Senator Kuderer, the assault weapon ban, the latest effort to do that in Olympia, has stalled out again this session, as it has in previous years, despite Democratic control in both chambers. Why is that?
Well, you know, gun legislation has always been challenging to pass, and we have pro-gun Democrats in our caucus, and so we're not lockstep on gun safety measures. But I do think one of the points that you raised earlier is a very important point to make, and I think it's actually the better question. Why don't we have Republicans supporting these common sense gun safety measures? Why aren't they there? Why do they lockstep say no to these measures.
Well, Republicans would answer that question by saying that they believe Democrats are focusing on the wrong things, that they're trying to make it harder for law-abiding gun owners to exercise their Second Amendment rights. I kind of go back to my question of, if it is so common sense, Democrats would only need a simple majority, correct? And you guys have more than that, certainly in both the House and the Senate. So why not sort of, I guess, work harder to get your own house in order and get the votes from them?
Well, like I said, we have pro-gun Democrats in our caucus, and it's not as easy as just walking up and convincing them to vote for the bill. Now, we did have a compromise on my bill 5038 dealing with banning guns at protests and the Capitol campus. So that was a compromise with pro-gun Democrats in the caucus, and that is over in the House right now and is ready to come to the House floor for a vote. So I would say that we are working on common sense measures. We are working to get as many Democrats and Republicans, quite frankly, to support these measures, because this issue, it isn't a red issue or a blue issue. No shooter walked in and asked first, are you a Democrat or a Republican, before pulling the trigger. This affects all of us. And as I said, I think the better question is, why aren't the Republicans with us when these laws will definitely make our communities safer?
Well, also, and I just would ask as a quick follow-up, just for the edification of our viewers, how far off are you in the Senate? If a vote came today to ban assault weapons, how far off would you be?
In terms of getting it voted off the Senate floor?
Yes.
I would say one vote.
Who's the one vote?
Well, the pro-gun Democrats. I'm not going to single out one of my colleagues for this, and they're entitled to their opinion. So I'm not saying that they're not, but I do think that we are very close to having it pass in the Senate. We're not there yet.
One of the other narratives you hear, and in fact, Senator Patty Murray brought it up as well, is she talked about Republicans and their special interest groups. The NRA is bankrupt. The NRA is on the phone begging people for money. Do you guys believe that the NRA will really continue to have any significant influence moving forward in spiking or helping to spike some of these pieces of legislation, Congresswoman?
Well, I think the biggest way we move legislation is for people to speak up and speak out, and to talk to their legislators about why they're not supporting legislation to make sure we have common sense gun reforms. That's how we see real change. And whether or not the NRA clearly invested a lot of money trying to fight gun legislation from moving forward, but really the loudest voice we have is the American people, and that continued push, I think, is what's going to make the difference.
But are you worried about the NRA anymore?
I think there's always clearly Republicans will continue to engage there and continue to have their concerns, but in the end, they're answer to their constituents, and that's who they need to listen to.
Senator Couture, the same question for you. The NRA for years has been painted as sort of the big bad wolf that's stopping a lot of these efforts in their tracks. Do you think they're really a player in this debate anymore?
Yes, I do. I think that people still listen to them. They have controlled the narrative for decades, and trying to change that narrative has been very difficult and challenging, but the people are there now, and they have been there for quite some time. And I think that we need to listen to the common sense gun safety measures that they want in place. And let me just say this, Brandy, we've done it the way the NRA says we should do it for decades. Don't put restrictions on the Second Amendment. And look where it's gotten us. America is in a category all by itself when it comes to gun violence. There isn't another country that even comes close, and that includes Yemen. We are in a category all by ourselves, and that is not where we should be. I think that we can do both. We can protect the Second Amendment, people can defend themselves in their homes, and we can have common sense gun safety measures that protect the public at large. And that's what we're talking about here.
Congresswoman, there's been this question about whether President Biden should take executive action on gun reform. Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, said this week in an interview with CBS that that's not the preference, that the preference would be for Congress to take action. because it would be more long lasting. And I know a Republican president wouldn't come in and reverse it. Do you believe that that's the appropriate course still, is to try to get it through congressionally?
Well, I do think it's important that Congress acts. I think it's a responsibility for us to put those laws in place, and our constituents are asking for that. We are in a public health crisis, and yet we still have not addressed another public health crisis we have, and that's gun violence across our country. We had Republicans trying to prevent dollars going into research in terms of the causes of gun violence, to prevent that from moving forward. So this has been a long effort and an important effort, and Congress needs to act. We did in the House, and we are hoping the Senate will take action.
So is there any one thing that you do think the president should do with his own power?
I think right now he's going to continue to raise this issue and to push on Congress. We just passed our legislation earlier this month, and so we're going to hope that and work with the Senate to try to get legislation through the Senate.
And I know some of you are probably thinking, Brandy, why'd you have two Democrats on? No dissent. Look, Democrats are in power. And to me, I think it is much more relevant to hear, one, what they want to do, and two, to have the discussion over what they have the power and the votes to do. And you can see in Olympia, they're pretty close to having the votes. I don't know if it's going to happen next session. But if they're just one vote away now, they got a whole year to convince that one vote, just one vote, to pass a ban on assault rifles. So we'll see what happens. Also, if you're interested in more of that conversation, please make sure to download the Divide podcast. Just search The Divide with Brandy Cruz wherever you get your podcasts. And we're also going to, by the way, in that extended episode, talk a little bit about the gun control bills they have been able to pass down in Olympia with Democratic majorities. All right, coming up after the break, our interview with the latest candidate to enter the race for Seattle mayor. And later, a message to those who claim to be advocates for the homeless but are doing more harm than good. Stick around. Another week, another candidate in the race for Seattle mayor, and another voice who is frankly concerned about the direction of the city. Former state representative Jessin Farrell ran for mayor back in 2017, but failed to make it through the primary. She got fourth in the primary election. She obviously hopes that this time is going to be different. What do you hope or think would be different this time around?
Well, this is a really different political environment, in part because people are struggling so much, whether it is because of economic hardship, because of COVID, or isolation, racial injustice. If you're a parent like me, the struggles with remote learning. And I just think that the hardship has been made all the harder by a lack of city leadership. And voters are really hungry for someone who can articulate a vision of what our city can be, and then have that relentless determination to implement that vision every single day.
You said what our city can be. You said in your video announcement of your campaign that it is hard to be proud of Seattle right now. What do you mean?
Yeah, I have heard this over and over again, this sense that we are not proud of this city, that we have these really big challenges, homelessness, again, the COVID economy and isolation, what is going to happen to downtown, the closures of small businesses, and this sense that we really should be able to be doing better. People love being from this city and living in this city, but this is a moment where people are really wondering, can we turn our challenges into success? And I want to run because I think the core issue right now is this going to be a city that we want to live in and can afford to live in? And there are answers to both of those things.
Let's talk about some of the most divisive issues the city is facing. The show we do is called The Divide, and we talk about controversial issues. Homelessness is one of them. Just a couple feet to your right, people living here at Gasworks Park, and it's really proliferated in the city, and I think become more visible during the pandemic as people stay home from their daily lives. For you, what do you believe is not working in our city's efforts to try to deal with that crisis?
I think first of all, we need to acknowledge that we've put ourselves in this box that, as a parent with kids, just makes no sense. Why are we pitting parks against compassionate solutions to helping people come inside?
And what do you mean by that?
And so I'll tell you what I mean by that. A park in a city is part of the social contract. If we are expecting people to live closely together in a dense community, and I love cities and I am a real proponent of that, Our parks have to be safe places to recreate for every single person, regardless of age and ability. And the other thing we have to acknowledge and just say truthfully is that they are not safe places for people to sleep. They're just not made for that. The second thing that we have to acknowledge, though, is that we have not been leaning into the solutions that we know that work. And I want to name one. In COVID, we recognize that helping people get into hotels is a really important solution. And we've left money on the table. We've left federal dollars on the table instead of saying, we're going to put all hands on deck. This is a crisis, and we're going to do everything we can to help people get inside. And there are a couple other things that are true too, though. Seattle needs to be a leader on this, but this is a regional issue. It is a state problem and it is a national problem, and we need to be building up our relationships locally and across the country to really get in front of this problem.
What role do you believe that police should play, if any, in homeless outreach?
So I'm going to just kind of take a step back and lay out a vision of public safety, because this is where this all starts to really intersect, and I think we need to bring these conversations together. So my take on this, and I think that a lot of people really share my values, is that no one in our city should have to go about their day-to-day lives and fear for their safety, right? Regardless of their color. And for too many Black and brown members of our community, when they are calling for help in a crisis situation, when they're getting in their cars, that's something that may create a sense of fear and even actual harm. And so when we're talking about public safety, even as it relates to the homelessness crisis, we need to be talking about what our overall vision is and investing in those things that work, and then really changing the way we do other things. And so to get back to that question then around homelessness, we have a crisis response system that has really relied on policing, and that has created a lot of conflict. It has created a cycle of put people in jail, they come back out, they haven't addressed maybe their underlying mental and behavioral health issues. But there are solutions that have been working that we need to scale up. I point to the Health One program that the fire department runs. We should really be leaning into that kind of thing.
You've said a couple times now, every person in Seattle deserves to feel safe when they call for help. There are people waiting 9.5 minutes for a priority 1 call. That is a life or death situation. Could be a shooting, could be a rape. 9.5 minutes is too long. So how do you have those conversations about reimagining public safety, about directing police resources where they need to go, while not having this continued exodus of police officers who are frustrated with feeling like they might not have a job here in a year or two, or they're not welcomed by the city, or they're not appreciated?
Right, and so I think one of the issues is that we have put the conversation around staffing levels in front of the strategic planning and outcomes of what we want. Anyone who's run a large organization knows that you don't do staffing levels without having a clear understanding of what it is that we want. And we often use the word of, reimagining public safety, and that's really important. But part of this is also just opening our eyes to those programs that already work. And again, Health One is an example, but there are other things that are working too around community crisis response. So it is unacceptable that you wait 9 minutes when you are in a violent or dangerous situation. Let's just say that very clearly. But we can't have a successful long-term conversation about staffing levels and feel proud of ourselves in 5 years because we've solved problems without first finding alignment around what it is that we're trying to solve for.
And you can find our full unedited interview with Jess and Farrell on the Divide podcast. One of the other things we talked about that you can listen to on the podcast is the fact that she's white. All of the other major candidates in the race for mayor are people of color, and I asked her whether she thinks that would have an impact on her ability to win. So you can hear that conversation. Make sure to download and subscribe to our podcast. I wanted to ask all of you, because we've been airing interviews with mayoral candidates every single week since they started coming into the race. So I put up a poll on Twitter just to ask you guys what you're most concerned about in the race for Seattle mayor. The vast majority of you said public safety, 48%, 37% said homelessness, although some argued that public safety and homelessness in a lot of ways go hand in hand, so maybe my poll was flawed. It's a Twitter poll, okay? It's not perfect, but this is what I got for you. 9% said post-pandemic recovery. That really surprised me. I thought that number was going to be higher given the sad state of downtown Seattle. 6% said other. Some of you said you just don't want any socialists. Open government, a few of you said, is important to you, so it's interesting to hear your feedback on that. All right, coming up after the break, switching gears a little bit, people who claim to care about the homeless are sure acting a lot like they don't care about the homeless. My closing commentary is next. It's time we have an honest conversation about some people who claim to be advocates for the homeless. People who show up to protest and try to stop homeless camps from being swept, or people who get the homeless hotel rooms only to stop paying for those rooms to make a point about housing for all. It's time that we just say what is true. Those people don't actually care about the homeless. They only care about pushing a political agenda and have no concern for the consequences their actions might have for those who they claim to care about so much. Why else would you fight to keep people at Seattle's Cal Anderson Park? A homeless camp where there were reported rapes, where a woman was murdered? Why would you fight to keep people in those conditions? And then there were those takeover of hotels, so-called homeless advocates convincing people that they could have a warm, safe place to sleep and a roof over their head free of cost, that the rooms were paid for. But that's not what it was actually about. Oh no. Those so-called advocates stopped paying for those rooms, eliciting a police response in Olympia. Exactly what they knew would happen and what they wanted to happen all along. Putting unwitting homeless people at the center of one of their ploys, literally using them as pawns to further a political agenda. And look, you do not have to take my word for it, that's fine. But how about one of the homeless people who was given one of those free rooms?
I wanted to get out of this weather that you see coming down on us right now. It's been a long time since I've been able to get a nice bed and a shower and stuff like that. So when I was told that I had an opportunity to get that, I jumped on it. Everything that followed after that was absolutely not in any way my consent, or I'm not okay with it at all.
Not okay with it at all. And in case his opinion also doesn't matter, how about we go up to Bellingham, where you have so-called homeless advocates harassing the mayor and allegedly assaulting the husband of a progressive city council member who has been trying to get more resources in place to help the city's unsheltered.
This is not okay. So this has to end. I mean, I know people are going to come at me and say things, but this is not right. And this is not helping the people who are unsheltered, who are at that park. To be able to stand between them and services and outreach is wrong. To use people for a protest is wrong.
To use people for a protest is wrong. And you will never convince me that you care about the homeless, that you are an advocate for the homeless, when all of your actions prove otherwise. All right, thank you so much. The issue of the homeless really gets me, because we have so many instances of people saying they care and then doing things that show they truly do not care for the well-being of people who are suffering on the streets. As I had mentioned earlier, my producer said in my ear, why don't you pitch your podcast again? So I will. Please make sure to download our Divide podcast. We post extras on there every single Monday. Until next time, I'll see you tomorrow on Q13 News This Morning.